The grand ballroom of the Prestwick Hotel was a sight to behold. Its opulent chandeliers sparkled like diamonds, casting a golden glow across the room. Marble pillars lined the space, and the soft hum of a live string quartet added a touch of elegance to the evening. The event was one of the most prestigious charity galas in the city, drawing together the wealthiest patrons, business leaders, and celebrities, all dressed in their finest gowns and tailored tuxedos. It was an evening where the city's elite would mingle, network, and, most importantly, show off their wealth while making generous donations. Among the attendees was a man who stood out, not because of his presence, but because of how poorly he blended in with the glamorous crowd. He looked out of place, dressed in old, worn-out clothes that had seen better days. His suit, if you could call it that, was a mismatched combination of a frayed jacket and baggy trousers. His shoes were scuffed, and his tie hung awkwardly around his neck, as if he hadn't quite figured out how to tie it properly. With his unkempt beard and slightly dishevelled hair, he appeared more like someone wandering in from the street than someone attending an exclusive event. His name was Edward, though no one knew it yet. He moved quietly through the crowd, his gaze lingering on the decor, the elaborate table settings, and the attendees who barely noticed his presence. He seemed to be observing the event from a distance, a soft, thoughtful smile tugging at the corners of his lips. As he approached the entryway to the ballroom, Edward spotted a large banner hanging above the entrance that read, "The Prestwick Charity Gala, supporting education for underprivileged children." It was a cause close to his heart, one he had supported for many years in his own quiet way. But tonight his connection to the gala went far deeper than anyone could have guessed. Edward continued to stroll through the ballroom, trying to stay inconspicuous, but it didn't take long for someone to notice his less than appropriate attire. Eyes began to follow him, subtle whispers spread among the attendees, and a few judgmental glances were cast in his direction. In this world of luxury, appearances were everything, and Edward's dishevelled look was raising more than a few eyebrows. Near the grand entrance, a tall, muscular security guard named Jack stood at attention, scanning the room for any potential issues. Jack took his job very seriously, priding himself on maintaining order and ensuring that only those who truly belonged in the exclusive event were allowed to remain. He had been briefed on the importance of the gala, how it was the most prestigious event of the year, and how the guests were some of the city's most influential figures. Anyone who didn't fit in with the image of wealth and status was to be dealt with promptly. That's when Jack noticed Edward. The man's shabby appearance immediately caught Jack's attention. From his ill-fitting clothes to his scuffed shoes, everything about Edward screamed that he didn't belong. Jack narrowed his eyes and made his way toward Edward, determined to address the situation before any of the high-profile guests became uncomfortable. "Excuse me, sir," Jack said in a firm voice as he approached Edward. "Can I see your invitation?" Edward paused, turning to face the security guard with a polite smile. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, handing it to Jack without a word. Jack unfolded the paper, glancing at the faded print. It was indeed an invitation to the gala, but the condition of the paper and the man's appearance raised Jack's suspicions. Something didn't add up. He had seen the guests arriving earlier, stepping out of luxury cars and dressed in designer outfits, flashing expensive watches and jewelry. This man looked like he had walked in off the street. Jack looked Edward up and down, his expression stern. "I'm afraid there must be some mistake," he said coldly. "This event is for invited guests only. You can't be here dressed like that." Edward's smile faltered slightly, but he remained calm. "I assure you I'm supposed to be here. I received an invitation." Jack shook his head, folding his arms. "I don't think so. You can't just walk into an event like this dressed like that. This is a high-class affair. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Edward blinked, surprised by the guard's tone. He glanced around, noticing the stares from the other guests, the whispers behind raised hands. He could feel the judgment in the air, but instead of becoming defensive, Edward simply nodded. "I see," he said quietly. "I didn't realize my appearance would cause so much trouble." Jack raised an eyebrow, unmoved by Edward's calm demeanor. "You're lucky I'm not calling the police," he added, grabbing Edward's arm gently but firmly. "Now, let's not make a scene. I'll escort you out." Edward allowed Jack to lead him toward the exit, not resisting or arguing. As they passed by the elegantly dressed guests, Edward noticed how they averted their eyes, not wanting to associate with the man being escorted out of the ballroom. It was as if they had already written him off, deeming him unworthy of their attention. As Edward was led through the lobby toward the entrance, another man stepped into the hotel, tall, middle-aged, and impeccably dressed in a tailored tuxedo. His name was James Whitmore, the event organizer and chairman of the charity that was benefiting from the evening's gala. James was well known for his charm, his connections in high society, and his ability to raise millions of dollars for various causes. He had been instrumental in planning the gala, and he prided himself on knowing every single major donor who would be attending. As soon as James walked in, he noticed the commotion by the door. The security guard, Jack, was in the process of escorting someone out. James frowned, curious about what was going on. He quickly made his way toward the two men. "What's going on here?" James asked, his tone firm but polite. Jack glanced over at James, relieved to see the event organizer. "Just handling a situation, Mr. Whitmore," Jack explained. "This man here was trying to get into the gala without the proper attire. He had an invitation, but I'm pretty sure he's not supposed to be here." James turned his attention to Edward, who stood quietly beside the security guard. His eyes widened slightly as he recognized the man before him. "Edward?" James said, his voice filled with surprise. Edward smiled, though it was a little sheepish. "Hello, James." Jack's eyes darted between the two men, his confusion growing. "Wait. You know him?" James nodded, his expression shifting from surprise to embarrassment. "Yes, I know him." He turned to Jack, his voice firm. "This man is Edward Carlyle, one of our largest benefactors. He's the main sponsor of tonight's event." The color drained from Jack's face. "Wait, what?" he stammered, disbelief lacing his voice. He's the main sponsor." James nodded again, his tone now more serious. "Yes, without his generous contributions, this gala wouldn't be happening." Jack's grip on Edward's arm loosened instantly, and he took a step back, his face flushed with embarrassment. I didn't know." "I'm so sorry, Mr. Carlyle," Jack stammered. "I didn't mean to. I thought you—" Edward raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "It's all right," he said calmly. "You were just doing your job." Jack's heart raced as he tried to process the situation. The man he had been so quick to judge based on his appearance, the man he had been moments away from kicking out, was the very person who had made the entire event possible. Shame washed over him as he realized how wrong he had been. As the tension between the three men settled, James stepped forward, addressing Edward with a respectful nod. "Edward, why don't we head back inside? The event is about to begin, and I'm sure there are many people who would love to meet you." Edward hesitated for a moment, glancing toward the ballroom where the well-dressed guests continued to mingle. He smiled faintly and shook his head. "Thank you, James, but I think I'll pass on that. I've never been one for the spotlight." James frowned slightly. "But, Edward, this event is for you. You've done so much for the charity, and people should know who you are." Edward chuckled softly, shaking his head again. "That's the thing, James. I don't do any of this for recognition. I do it because it matters." He turned to Jack, his expression kind despite the misunderstanding. "You're not the first person to make assumptions about me based on how I look," Edward said gently. "But it's important to remember that appearances can be deceiving. I've been in your shoes before, working hard, trying to do what's right. We all make mistakes." Jack's face reddened even further, but Edward's words seemed to lift some of the weight off his shoulders. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Carlyle," Jack repeated. "I didn't mean any disrespect. I just didn't realize—" Edward nodded. "I know, and it's all right. But remember, next time, don't be so quick to judge someone based on their clothes or how they look. You never know who they might be, or what they've been through." With that, Edward gave James a friendly nod, thanked him for organizing such a successful event, and turned to leave the hotel. As Edward walked out of the Grand Hotel and into the cool evening air, Jack and James stood in stunned silence. The guests inside the ballroom would continue to sip champagne and make small talk, unaware that the man responsible for the gala had just left quietly, unnoticed. Jack, still reeling from the interaction, turned to James. "I had no idea who he was," he murmured, almost to himself. "He didn't look like someone who could afford to sponsor an event like this." James sighed, shaking his head. "That's the thing about Edward Carlyle," he said thoughtfully. "He's one of the wealthiest men I know, but you'd never guess it from the way he dresses or acts. He inherited a fortune years ago, but instead of living a life of luxury, he dedicated himself to helping others, especially those who don't have the same opportunities he had." Jack listened in disbelief. "So, he's the one who funds this charity?" James nodded. "Yes, for the last decade he's been our biggest donor, but he never seeks attention for it. He doesn't want people to treat him differently because of his wealth. That's why he dresses the way he does and avoids the spotlight. He believes that helping people should come from the heart, not for recognition or fame." Jack was silent for a long moment, reflecting on what had just happened. He had spent his entire career working in high-end security, surrounded by wealth and status, and he had learned to judge people based on how they looked. But Edward Carlyle had shattered those assumptions in an instant. "I've learned a lesson today," Jack admitted quietly. "A big one." James smiled faintly, clapping Jack on the shoulder. "We all have. Don't be too hard on yourself. Edward's one of a kind." Meanwhile, as Edward walked down the street, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had always been a private man, someone who preferred to let his actions speak louder than his words. The gala would go on without him, raising money for a cause he cared deeply about, and that was all that mattered to him. He had never been interested in the glitz and glamour of high society. To Edward, true wealth wasn't about expensive clothes or lavish parties. It was about making a difference in the lives of those who needed it most. He had grown up in a working-class family where money had been scarce and every dollar had to be stretched. He knew what it was like to struggle, and when he had come into his fortune, he had made a promise to himself that he would use it for good. As Edward walked through the quiet streets, he thought about the night's events. He had seen the judgment in people's eyes, the way they had dismissed him without knowing anything about him. It was a reminder of how easy it was to make assumptions based on appearance, and how dangerous those assumptions could be. But Edward didn't hold any grudges. He understood that the world was full of people like Jack, people who had been conditioned to value wealth and status above all else. And he also knew that kindness, understanding, and humility were far more valuable than anything money could buy. Back at the Prestwick Hotel, the gala was in full swing. Guests continued to make donations, sip champagne, and chat about their lives of luxury, completely unaware that the man who had made the entire event possible had quietly left. But for Jack, the night had left a lasting impression. As he stood by the entrance, He couldn't stop thinking about Edward Carlyle and the lesson he had learned. In his mind, Jack replayed the words Edward had spoken. Appearances can be deceiving. It was a truth that would stick with Jack for a long time, a reminder that wealth and success weren't always visible on the surface, and that true kindness often came from the most unexpected places. We live in a world where appearances often dictate how we treat others. But as Edward Carlyle's story shows, true worth is not measured by wealth, clothing, or status. It's found in kindness, humility, and the desire to make a difference. The next time you find yourself judging someone based on how they look, remember that everyone has a story, and sometimes the most unassuming people have the biggest hearts. If you enjoyed this story, YouTube thinks you'll like these stories also.